Hello, I'm Matt Galloway, and this is the Current Podcast. It is known as the 30% rule. Your rent should not exceed 30% of your overall monthly income. A significant number of Canadian renters might say, well, good luck with that. They are bearing the brunt of the affordability crisis and paying much, much more.
100% of my income goes to my rent. I work 7 days a week. I'm waitressing on the weekend as well as my current full-time job. And we buy very little, like nothing extra, no haircuts, no clothes. I've used everything on my credit card. I'm at $2,500 and I'm trying to slowly bring it back down. And then my line of credit is also up, but there's nothing I can do about that.
Karen Sharmbury lives with her 2 teenage children in a rented townhouse in Kingston, Ontario. And with all her income going to rent, she relies on help from family and her community to help pay for groceries and other essentials.
To try to find a more affordable rental is almost impossible. And houses are so expensive right now. I feel like it's very unfair that I would have to pay $2,700 in rent, but for some reason I can't qualify for $2,000 in a mortgage. I just think that it's kind of like it's stacked against you, and it's a trap because it's impossible to get out of. Living this way, in order to cope, I try to think about my kids. And I just feel like for them, you can work 8 days a week if you have to. And that keeps me going.
Karen Sharmbury's predicament is not uncommon, and it's of growing concern. Last week, Tiff Macklem, the Governor of the Bank of Canada, sounded the alarm about renters and the increasing amount of debt that they're carrying. Many of those renters are carrying a balance of at least 90% of their credit card limits, and some are missing payments as well. Jennifer Smith is a renter in Toronto. Jennifer, good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm okay. In listening to Karen, how much of that sounds familiar to you?
It's scary how similar it is, and just hearing the emotion in her voice, it really resonates because this is what we're dealing with. I'm also a mom. I also have 2 kids, and I heard you say, sort of talking about the 30% of your income should go to rent. So I did some math here, and 30% of what I pay is only $966.
And how much is your rent?
It's over $3,200 a month, not including the utilities and hydro and all that fun stuff.
Wow. Can you you mentioned you're a mom, you have a couple of kids. Just describe the living situation that you're in and what you get for that amount of rent.
So our current living situation in terms of our house. So we rent our house. We did get lucky. We got in about 8 years ago. So actually, just even in August, we were told we had 2 months to leave. And that put us in a terrible situation. And what rent is costing everywhere now is absolutely, it just doesn't make sense, especially if you have kids and people that depend on you. Our house right now also is, we've got a mold situation. We've got a couple of appliances that aren't working. And then it's kind of, my husband and I discuss whether or not we bring this up to the landlord, or are they going to threaten to evict us? And I know the term, I think, is called rent eviction. Yeah. And so, where do we go from there? We can't, based on what the rent is costing us with the additional stuff, and that's not even counting food and daycare and all that. We don't even have enough to save up to move out. So people, I know I'm not the only one, people are stuck in homes that they are just barely able to afford, if at all. And because of that, we can't actually afford to move out.
I mean, in addition to this, and it's tricky talking to people about money, so tell me what you want to tell me, but debt is another issue that Tiff Macklem, the Governor of the Bank of Canada, was concerned about. Do you have debt that you're carrying as well as the rent that you're trying to pay?
Yes, absolutely. So I was listening to your previous person. She was talking about her credit card and her line of credit. I'm maxed out pretty much on both. And I'm not ashamed to say that, because that is the reality that, especially Torontonians are facing. How
did you end up in that situation, if you don't mind me asking, where you were maxed out on both?
Well, let's see here. So after I did 6 years of post-secondary, I already owed $28,000 to OSAP, so student loans. And then, having to move out into an apartment, I used my credit card to cover a lot of the costs. And I was obviously advised about how to use a credit card. But I think when you're 21, 22, you're really not grasping what that means. So I accumulated on my credit card. And then the area that we used to live in started to get very dangerous. So I had a young baby at the time, move out of that area. So I used my line of credit to get this house. And it's been 8 years and I have barely made a dent in both, to be quite frank.
I was going to say, how are you doing in terms of keeping up with the payments?
You have to prioritize your rent, your heating, your food over your payments. So sometimes it actually comes down to, am I going to pay my credit card this month, or am I going to make sure that my kids have enough food for their lunches? And it sounds dire and it's a scary situation to be in, but I'd rather miss a couple of payments and damage my credit than, not have a house or, fed kids.
How do you manage the stress of that? I mean, part of it is, as you said, trying to juggle all the balls that are up in the air. You have concerns about whether you're going to be able to stay in the place. And if you were to leave, the rent might be even more if you were to get into a different place. How are you managing the weight of all of that?
So, that's a great question. For me, personally, we're lucky we're a dual income house, but I'm also actively looking for a second job. I was working a second job, but had to quit due to safety reasons. So what I'm trying to do now is, in my main job, I work with teenagers. I'm just trying to use my stress to educate them and let them know, okay, let's be financially literate. You guys want to rent when you're older. Let's look at what that actually costs. So I use that to sit down with them and, they'll tell me where they want to move and we look at the actual cost. And then we look at, what jobs, what school requirements they need to be able to afford that kind of life. So it's very much turning a negative, stressful situation into a teachable moment for the next generation, so they don't end up as badly as we are, hopefully.
Why do you think you're in this situation? I mean, Tiff Macklem, the governor of the Bank of Canada, raised the alarm on this, talking about renters carrying a disproportionate amount of debt. You're in a dual income family. You've tried to figure out ways to get out of this. If you take a look at the bigger picture, why do you think people like yourself are in situations like this?
I think at least I can only sort of speak for myself. For me, it got as bad as it did because I wanted better. I wanted to get out of an area that made me feel unsafe, that made me feel my family unsafe. But the other thing is, when it comes to debt, is people don't realize when they're making their credit card payments that that's not really going towards principal. So they're paying the interest costs. And, why is my credit card bill not going down? Why is my line of credit? It's because you're paying, they're not really sure. And honestly, it feels like a scam because I have to pay my regular interest payments, whatever, per month. But then I have to pay additional money elsewhere just to attack the principal. And then in the meantime, I'm trying to cover ridiculous rents, cost of even traveling in the city with the traffic, daycare, food, again, all the utilities and just, clothes even. And she mentioned not going without haircuts. We've definitely my husband has definitely shaved my kids' heads because it's just cheaper than going to a barber. So I think, it's just how are we supposed to get ahead of this debt when the money we're putting towards it isn't even actually paying it off?
I'll let you go, but when you think of the future, if you were to kind of spool ahead 5 years or something like that, how do you see that future?
You know what? I'm dead set on being paid off. I'm hoping that interest rates go down. I'm hoping that I get that second job. I think that if we all just kind of pull together, there's ways to make changes to how the system is going.
I wish you the best of luck, Jennifer. Thanks for talking about money is it's a tricky thing with somebody that you've never met before, but I appreciate you being willing to go there. It's important, and it's a story that I think will be familiar to a lot of people across this country. So thanks.
No worries. Thank you for having me.
Take care. Jennifer Smith is a renter in Toronto. Ricardo Tranjan is a political economist with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and that organization has been studying rental affordability. He is in our Ottawa studio. Ricardo, good morning to you.
Good morning.
You surprised by the amount of debt these renters are carrying just to, find a place to live, but then also carry the cost of daily life?
Unfortunately, I'm not surprised. When we talk about interest rates, we immediately think about mortgages, and we worry about mortgage holders and how they're doing and whether they're going to be able to cope with increase in their mortgages. But when we take a step back, we know that there's a number of factors that make actually tenants and low-income households much more susceptible to inflation and to high interest rates, and they have less financial security all around. And so this situation that Jennifer described to us and the figures that came out of the Bank of Canada a couple of months ago are not particularly surprising.
I mentioned that 30% rule, the idea that you should spend no more than 30% of your monthly income on rent. Is there anywhere in this country now, in 2024, on the 1st of October of 2024, where you think that might apply?
Not really. We have conducted a study recently that looks at that, and we calculate something we call the rental wage, which is how much workers will need to earn to rent an average price apartment without spending more than 30% of their income on housing. And we assume people work 40 hours a week, 52 hours a year, and we calculate the rental wage for 1 and 2 bedroom apartments. And then we compare that rental wage, that amount, with the minimum wage, for example. And when we do that, we see that in every province, the minimum wage is lower than the one bedroom rental wage. It's much lower than the 2-bedroom rental wage. We did a calculation for 62 cities across the country, and only 9 of them would a minimum wage worker be able to afford a 1-bedroom apartment and stay below that 30% threshold. There's a number of cities right now that even 2 minimum wage workers, if they combine the income to try to get a 1-bedroom unit, they won't be able to. They will have to pay way more on housing.
So it's not just big ticket places like Toronto and Vancouver.
10 years ago, if you were having this conversation 10 years ago, we'd be talking about Vancouver and Toronto. But right now, it's pretty much everywhere. Even places like Halifax have become very unaffordable. With smaller towns like Peterborough or places in the prairies, renters are facing similar dire kind of situation.
How much do you think people are paying in rent? If it's not 30%, I mean, we heard 100% from one of our earlier guests. How much on average do you think people are actually paying of what they would make to be able to keep a roof over their heads?
Well, the data that we have shows that the average is 31%. And so that means that there's a lot of people that are way above that average. But what we have to remember here that is important as well is that about 62% of renters, so about 2/3 of renters, they're low income. And so they're like first, second quintile in the income distribution. And that in practice means they're earning less than $42,000 a year as a family income, right? So even if you stay with the 30% rule, you have to think and you have to ask yourself, how much is that 70% left and how much does that buy? You know, if you're the 20% top earners of renters, 70% it might be able to, get what you need. But if you're a minimum wage worker or a low wage worker, that 70%, it's not a lot. And rents go up every single year. And what we also studies show is that the rent increases are outpacing wage increases on a yearly basis.
So what do we do about this? I mean, part of it is about wages. These are people who may be earning more than the minimum wage. You could say raise the minimum wage, but that might not impact them because they're already past the minimum wage. What else do we do about that?
Well, in 1975, when inflation started going up, one of Ottawa's first anti-inflation measure was to persuade provinces to impose rent controls. And it worked. When inflation hit 12.5% in 1981, rent inflation was 6.4%. In other words, rents were pushing inflation down. If we look at the past year, we see exactly the opposite. Rent inflation was nearly 3 times more what the overhead, the general inflation figure was, meaning rents were pushing inflation up. So we need to have a serious conversation about rent controls in Canada, including a conversation about what a national rent control policy would look like. Similarly to Germany, Ireland, Scotland, Spain, even more recently France under Emmanuel Macron, which ideologically was opposed to it, but eventually got convinced that there was something that was needed, and now they're in the process of rolling out a national rent control policy.
That's what you think we need here. We need a national rent control policy?
We could have a national rent control policy, or we could have provincial governments strengthening their policies. Ontario, Quebec, and BC have rent controls with major flaws that everyone can point to. We have 4 provinces that have no rent controls whatsoever. And I think that's the biggest elephant in the room in the whole housing affordability debate.
One of the things, part of this is about affordability, but it's also about supply. One of the things we've heard on this program from developers, and these aren't people who they're in this, as a business, but they say in many ways that if you have rent controls on, you will lose the incentive to create more rental housing. That it's simply it's not worth it for them to do that they could instead move toward market housing and sell the condos or sell the units rather than rent them. At a time when this is an issue of supply and demand, do you worry that putting that rent control on is going to dampen the supply?
Well, to be honest, to ask the real estate industry what they think about rent controls is sort of like asking my kids if they want another serving of veggies or a bowl of ice cream. I know what the answer will be, and I think that we shouldn't let that answer drive our policies.
But even if that answer, if you find it unpalatable, I'm not saying that you don't like ice cream, but if you find it unpalatable, it still might lead to people not building rental housing. Isn't that not something we need to consider?
We have a lot of research on this, and the research that shows a clear distinction between rent freezes that were implemented during war times, they were implemented during recessions, and they did have a negative impact on both supply and on the quality of that supply. And the argument that we're hearing from the real estate industry holds for rent freezes. But we have a lot of more research now coming out about what we call second-generation rent controls, which are the rent controls that we have right now. They're adjusted for inflation, they let prices rents keep up with the cost of living. And the empirical research on those rent controls is very clear. It doesn't have the same negative impacts. And there's things we can do to mitigate impacts. For example, there are now a lot of incentives for the industry to create more supply through tax subsidies, to subsidize loans, and those offset. So there are very elaborate and straightforward ways to have good rent controls. And we should not let what is essentially a self-interested argument, and often, to be quite honest, a kind of a threat to politicians, put rent controls and we stop building. And if you stop building, you will look bad. We should not allow that to drive the conversation, because the absence of rent controls has an impact on Jennifer, Karen, but also has a negative impact on the economy, on the other sectors of the economy also suffer.
We just have a minute or so left. Is your sense that politicians are paying attention to this? I mean, there's this imbalance people will point to between renters and homeowners, that homeowners will often get the ear of politicians, in part because politicians, for the most part, are homeowners themselves. Many of them don't rent. And so is your sense that they are attuned to this issue?
I think they are attuned to this issue, but I think the dominant discourse here that supply is the ultimate cause of the problem of affordability, and that supply is also the ultimate solution, is preventing us from having other conversations. Supply is important, don't get me wrong. We should continue to build housing. We should get rid of some zoning legislation that makes no sense. We should be working on that front. But there are other more delicate conversations about rent controls and other things that we should be having too. We can't just focus on that one. Supply alone will not address the affordability question, and that's why we should we should confront that uncomfortable truth.
Talk about many things at the same time.
Yes.
Ricardo, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Ricardo Tranjan is a political economist with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. He was in our Ottawa studio. Do the stories that we have heard this morning sound familiar to you? How difficult is it to keep rent paid and manage all the other finances in your salary? Again, these are delicate conversations, but if you're willing to share that 30% rule, are you anywhere near that 30% rule? What's happening with credit card debt or line of credit when it comes to trying to keep a roof over your head and keep all the other, as we said, balls up in the air? You can email us. For renters, it'd be really interesting to hear from you. Email us, thecurrent@cbc.ca.